A former Navy veteran, his old medal pinned to his chest, stands silently at the harbor. A group of young men jeers, calling him a show-off. Their taunts cut like knives, yet his gaze remains unshaken. Then, just 1 hour later, the roar of warship engines thunders across the water. A fleet appears, led by an old comrade, eyes blazing with determination. What secret lies behind that medal? Why does the whole town reel when the truth is revealed? This is not just a story of a man insulted. It is the journey of loyalty, wartime memories, and the undying flame of a hero. Discover the story of George Harlan, who makes us realize the true value of sacrifice. Don't look away. This tale will take you from injustice to a brilliant climax where truth ignites like fire. Hit subscribe to Veteran Best Stories so you won't miss these soul-stirring accounts. The Newport Harbor lay silent, like a lingering minor chord. The wooden planks beneath George Harlan's slow steps creaked softly, marking each deliberate footfall of the 77-year-old man whose chest bore an old, tarnished silver medal, a testament to time. The salty sea breeze swept through his white hair beneath a faded baseball cap, ruffling the worn shoulders of his navy coat. George said nothing, only nodded to the fishermen as he always did, and offered a gentle smile to the children selling bait at the pier's edge. In his presence, words were unnecessary. His bearing alone brought comfort. He was like an ancient mast, standing firm against every storm, unbroken, unbowed, quietly resolute. His boat, Storm's Honor, rested in its usual berth as it had for 40 years. The oak hull had faded and patchworked under sun and salt. The anchor line frayed from countless hands' grip, and a small plaque in the pilot house simply read, "Memories," a whispered promise never to forget. To tourists, it might appear an old, weathered vessel, but to Newport's people, it was a living symbol, a flame that carried the stories of souls never to return from the sea. George often used that boat to take veteran families out into the bay, sharing old recollections, comrades who had fallen, battles waged on tumultuous waves, and the tale of the storm of 1968 when he had saved 30 lives. He never boasted of it. He only spoke when someone needed to hear, and he spoke with reverence, never a hint of hollow pride. That morning, the ocean was unnaturally calm. George prepared for a routine trip, checking the sail lines, polishing the small wooden plaque, arranging the familiar tools. A young woman, 18-year-old volunteer Sophie Wells, helped him stow wooden chairs on deck, quick and earnest, yet respectful in every gesture toward George. All was set. No one guessed that the tranquil morning might be marred by needless cruelty. As George stepped down the gangway, a group of youths gathered on the far side of the dock. Their laughter cut through the silence like a blade across water. "Look at the old man there. Thinks he's some hero, huh?" One sneered, cold and mocking. They pointed at his medal with disdain. "Bet he bought that trinket at a flea market." George halted. He said nothing, offered no reaction, only for a moment. His eyes darkened, not in anger, but in sorrow. Yet he remained upright, his spine unshaken. The crowd clustered around. Passers-by glanced over, but no one spoke. No one defended him. No one argued. No one stood with him. Sophie's heart clenched. She stayed silent, pulled out her phone, recorded the scene, then posted it online with the caption, "They mocked George. He saved 30 lives." George sat down on a nearby wooden bench, still clutching the medal, a memento he never wore with pride, only in remembrance. The breeze blew colder than usual. Mrs. Clara, the cafe owner on the corner, approached, setting a steaming cup of coffee beside him. But George did not drink. He gazed out at the sea, where waves still lapped the pier, where he had carried countless souls into the deep, and had bid farewell to many friends who never came home. Their laughter still echoed behind him, no longer loud, but sharp enough to cut deep. Sophie stood there, her hand clenching the phone. She did not fully understand war, but she knew one thing clearly: gratitude must not be silenced. George sat unmoving, like a lighthouse in the mist. In his aged, cloudy eyes, a faint flame still burned, not the flame of anger, but the flame of justice. He knew the cruel words would vanish in time, but the truth, no matter how deeply buried by time or mockery, would be returned by the endless sea. Justice does not come from noise. It comes from distant waves, quiet, yet never ceasing. The silver medal lay silent on George Harlan's chest, its gleam dulled by time, yet every scratch upon its surface etched unspoken memories, years spent on the open sea, the final calls of his comrades, and that fierce storm years ago. He did not need to recount these tales, for that gaze, cold, burdened, yet full of pride, spoke 1,000 unvoiced words. Those eyes now stared unblinkingly toward the empty space where mocking laughter had once echoed. Unblinking, unshaken, he seemed to look right through them, not to retaliate, but to remember. Newport Harbor, usually alive with the hurried footsteps of fishermen, the slap of waves against hulls, the distant wail of a ship's horn, had fallen into stillness, as if the dock were the stage before a great battle and all held their breath. The air was taut, like a drawn bowstring. The video Sophie had captured, titled, "They Are Mocking Mr. George," had spread like wildfire through the small town within hours. Every corner of Newport buzzed with its ripple. The familiar coffee shop murmured in urgent tones. The church fell silent mid-sermon. Neighborhood meetings grew unusually boisterous. Newport had been awakened, not by a tempest from the ocean, but by a rising tide of outrage from within. Storm's Honor, George's battered yet steadfast vessel, had long ceased to be merely a boat. It carried stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and unbreakable brotherhood. Each time he took a family of veterans out onto the bay, he did more than recall the fallen. He kept them alive, in memory, on the waves, and in his very breath. But now that cold laughter smeared a stain upon that sacred flame. George stood motionless, the medal still cradled in his hand, cold as the unwavering resolve in his eyes, as though he held within him the honor of countless souls, refusing to let go. Social media erupted. The video garnered tens of thousands of views by midday. Beneath the post, an outpouring of solidarity swelled like a breached dam. Show him respect. Heroes need not speak, they need only stand. An old journalist from Providence shared his own post, which spread nationwide. In 1970, I heard Mr. Harlan recount the storm aboard Storm's Honor. I never forgot how he spoke of his comrades. No complaints, only deep reverence. He is a hero, silent yet steadfast. Such words shot from Newport across the country, striking at the very heart of America's soul, where the memory of the soldier never sleeps. At the naval base in Norfolk, Frank Dawson, who had fought alongside George, sat silently, staring at his phone's screen. The video was a dagger to the heart. He remembered George's words in that very storm. "Frank, you are our guiding light." Now, that light had been rekindled. Frank rose with determination. "Prepare the fleet. We're heading to Newport. My friend will not endure this disgrace alone." Meanwhile, George remained unaware of the gathering storm. He stood on the dock in silence as sea breeze stirred his faded navy cap and frayed jacket. Clara, the owner of the corner cafe, approached with a steaming cup of coffee. But this morning, attached was a loaf of fresh brown bread. Her hand trembled as she offered it to him. Her eyes brimmed with affection. "You are our beacon, George," she whispered. He nodded softly, needing no words. When memory becomes so vast, presence alone moves hearts. The Coast Guard stood by, observing. They did not intervene, but their eyes were pensive. The mayor remained silent, offering no statement, yet this quiet could not quell the rising tide on social media. Veterans groups continued to share the video, launching the Protect Mr. Harlan campaign. The hashtag Honor George exploded across platforms, spreading from coast to coast in a heartbeat. Sophie began her live stream, her voice cracking with emotion. "Mr. George is more than a man. He is our collective memory, our past, the very identity of this town." She need not shout. Truth forged its own path. A fellow sailor messaged from afar. "I'm alive because of him. Storm's Honor was never just a boat. It was a sanctuary." Frank checked his phone one last time, eyes alight. "All hands, set sail," he commanded. No questions. Everyone understood. This was more than a voyage. It was a response. A silent, powerful wave of justice rising from the depths of the human heart, headed for Newport, where one old sailor still stood firm as a mast in a gale, medal in hand, eyes fixed upon the sea. Justice needs not hurry. It comes, steadfast and unceasing, like the undercurrent of the ocean itself. The waves seemed to hold their breath. Newport, usually bathed in the gentle glow of morning light, now carried an unfamiliar tremor, as if the very storm of 1968 had quietly returned. Not with wind, nor thunder, but with a stirring deep within human hearts. George Harlan still stood there, unwavering at the end of the wooden pier, his back as straight as a mast in a gale, his hand clasping the old silver medal upon his chest. The metal face was scratched, cold and heavy, but his eyes burned brighter, fiercer. They did not look at the crowd, nor gaze into the past, but stared resolutely toward the future, where his boat, Storm's Honor, remained silently moored, an unspoken witness to every sacrifice. Newport Harbor, usually alive with the clank of anchor chains, the thrash of fish in nets, and the hurried footsteps of fishermen at dawn, was today devoid of sound. Only compressed silence remained, like a forge melting anger into steel. The video Sophie recorded and posted had exceeded all expectations. Overnight, it spread across the nation like a hurricane making landfall. The story of an old sailor being mocked was no longer Newport's alone. It had become a warning to an entire generation about memory, gratitude, and justice. Storm's Honor was not merely a boat, it was a living relic, where George had preserved the souls of 30 men who once faced death on the open sea. It was where he shared stories absent from textbooks, but forever engraved on every listener's heart. With each voyage into the bay alongside veterans' families, George rekindled a flame of remembrance, of survival. Yet the mocking laughter of those youths, like a poisonous wind, had threatened to extinguish that flame. In the face of such hurt, George said nothing. He only clasped his medal tighter, letting his eyes speak his defiance. Online, the wave of support surged by the hour. Comments flooded every platform. Honor him! No one may mock the man who gave his life for 30 others. A Boston veteran posted a long message. I met Mr. Harlan in 1980, when my life had lost its way. It was Storm's honor that brought me back. He taught me to stand again. That post, like a lightning bolt in the dark, was swiftly shared by national news outlets. Television networks covered the story. Millions of hearts began to beat as one. The question reverberated. Who will restore the flame for Mr. George? At the Norfolk Naval Base, Frank Dawson, who had fought beside George on the open sea, stood silently before his phone's screen. In his hands lay files about the old storm, but his eyes were fixed on Sophie's video. No words were spoken, yet Frank's expression said it all. Seeing George endure that humiliation cut him like a blade. Frank was not merely an officer. He was one of the 30 George had saved from the furious waves. He understood George's true value, and he understood that it was time to repay that debt of honor. Without hesitation, he issued the command. Fleet, assemble. We sail for Newport. George must be honored. Meanwhile, in Newport, George remained unaware. He stood, unmoving as a stone, unmoved by distant sounds. Clara, the owner of the corner cafe, approached with a steaming cup of coffee, her eyes red with tears. You are our hope, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. George merely nodded, not drinking. His gaze stayed fixed on the sea, where the waves still lapped gently against the dock, where he had carried countless souls into the depths and bid farewell to so many friends who never returned. Behind his back, the Coast Guard officers in uniform had appeared. They simply watched, saying nothing. No one intervened. No one spoke up. The town's mayor, though informed of the incident, made no public statement. Yet even as the authorities remained silent, the storm on social media showed no sign of abating. Veterans associations nationwide continued sharing the story, sending letters to television networks, organizing urgent meetings, each bearing the same message: George Harlan is a hero, and America must not forget. The hashtag #honor. George appeared on every platform, at every hour. As time passed, the wave grew ever stronger. This was no mere movement. It was a moral tsunami beyond anyone's ability to stop. George still knew nothing. He stood motionless, his gaze locked on the horizon. Yet out in those distant waters, ships were already cleaving through the waves, bringing justice and remembrance. No longer a mast alone in a storm, he had become the cornerstone for a great wave rising. Justice, like the untamable tide, was coming from over the horizon, and this time it carried light. Newport Harbor awoke as if from a long slumber. The water lay still, a gentle sea breeze stirred, yet the air felt searing like a blast furnace. From every corner of the town, people poured into the harbor, their eyes fixed upon the silver-haired man standing resolute on the weathered planks. George Harlan, 77 years old, his back still straight, his gaze still blazing, his hand gripping the old silver medal on his chest, was like a living statue carved from America's own memory. Before him lay Storm's honor, his old, dark oak vessel, lying silent as though awaiting a sacred rite. To George, it had never been mere transportation. It was the flame of memory, where he had once held 30 lives mid-death. Every voyage, George did more than navigate. He brought an entire generation safely back. Yet some group of youths, with a few mocking laughs, had thrown mud upon that flame. George did not respond. He did not need to. He simply stood there in silence, his gaze speaking all that words could never carry. And then, a strange sound tore through the air. The blast of a ship's horn echoed from the horizon straight to the heart. The water trembled. 3 naval destroyers, their American flags fluttering from afar, raced toward the harbor. Their steel bows cleaved the bay's surface like the blade of justice cutting through silence. A patrol plane skimmed the sky overhead. Its propellers shrieked through the air. Its shadow swept across the water like a steel bird of the past returning home. The entire harbor froze. Fishermen dropped their nets. Children stumbled on the wooden planks. Aunt Clara, who brought George his coffee each morning, dropped her porcelain mug, the shards scattering like her own heart shattering with emotion. Everyone lifted their heads and watched, their eyes unblinking, as if they were witnessing history come to life before them. From the lead destroyer, a man disembarked, tall, clad in a crisp navy uniform, his rows of medals gleaming in the sun. Frank Dawson, who had once braved life and death with George in that fateful storm, now stood as a senior officer. Behind him trailed 3 young officers, each step sharp and proud. The crowd parted before them like waves parting water. Frank said nothing. He strode directly to George, placed a firm hand upon his old friend's shoulder, and nodded as if sealing an unspoken vow. Then he turned before the crowd, his voice ringing out through the charged air. George Harlan does not boast. In 1968, amid a raging storm, he saved 30 sailors. When every other ship turned back, he steered Storm's honor straight into the waves. Silence fell so thick it seemed to choke the air. Only the long, mournful blast of the ship's horn acknowledged it, an ocean's own confirmation. Aunt Clara wept out loud. "Oh, Lord." Emotions flooded forward like a levee breaking. Frank continued, his eyes never leaving George. "That medal, it is not a mere decoration. It bears witness to life. It tells the story of those who lived on because of him." The crowd shuddered. Eyes that once turned away now fixed upon George. They no longer saw just an old man with silver hair. They beheld a torch burning quietly for half a century. The youths who had mocked George stepped back, heads bowed, their gazes wavering, unable to meet his eyes. A Coast Guard officer standing nearby silently lowered his head, lips moving as though muttering an apology. But Frank paid them no mind. He had not come to argue. He came to restore the truth. From among the Navy ranks, a woman emerged, her white uniform crisp as snow, her rows of medals shining like the sunlit sea at dawn. Colonel Margaret Lyle, the base commander, stood before George. Her face was solemn, yet her eyes softened when they met his. She bowed her head, then spoke in a measured, unwavering tone. "Mr. Harlan, the United States Navy owes you a debt." She recounted the events of 1968, when George, despite a wounded shoulder, steered Storm's honor right through the heart of the storm. When all communications failed, he navigated by instinct and experience, saving those stranded in the tempest. "Storm's honor," she said, "has since become a sacred vessel." No one spoke further. The harbor lay silent as a chapel, hanging on every word. Then she held up an object, a gleaming bronze plaque inscribed with, "In honor of George Harlan, the Storm's flame." As the plaque was placed in his hands, applause broke out, like waves crashing upon the shore. Sobs mingled with the clapping hands. No one could hold back their emotion. George gazed down at the bronze, his hand quivering ever so slightly, his eyes misting, not from age, but because memories were surging back like a rising tide. Frank couldn't contain himself. He embraced George, holding him tightly. A young officer stepped forward, presenting him with a neatly folded American flag, each ridge sharp and square like a steadfast heart. George reached out and accepted it. The flag rested gently in his hand, and his eyes still burned like a flame. The 3 destroyers anchored in the bay. The patrol plane circled once more, then soared away as though retreating from a solemn ceremony. Newport, once hushed, now glowed with new light, not from the sun, but from the rekindled flame of Storm's honor. That flame, no one could extinguish it. No jeer could tarnish it. For it was the flame of honor, the flame of America. George Harlan stood tall on the deck of Storm's honor, the oak hull weathered by time, slowly drifting with the early morning sea breeze. The old silver medal on his chest glittered, not from sunlight, but from the light within him, a steadfast light like a lighthouse, endlessly illuminating Newport Harbor. George's eyes bore no trace of age. Instead, they shone like mirrors, reflecting the memories of the 30 souls who once grasped his hand through death in 1968. Once, this boat had been mocked. Once, it had been the target of scathing laughter. But now, it is a flame, not a burning flame, but a flame that illumines. It ignites the memories, the gratitude, and the honor of the nameless sailors who once battled the merciless elements. And now, Newport, the town that once lay silent, that once turned its back, has become a gathering place of loyalty, a cathedral without walls, where George's story is causing the whole of America to fall silent in contemplation. But the Navy did not stop at bowing and tribute. After Colonel Margaret Lyle's speech, everything was officially marked. Storm's honor was recognized as a symbol of wartime memory, not merely an old boat, but a living witness to history. George was invited to lead the annual commemorative ceremony in the bay, a solemn event with generational significance. The man who had been mocked for living quietly in the past now stood before the crowd, his voice warm as the waves, recounting the stories of his brothers, those who never returned. Beside him stood Frank Dawson, his old comrade, now salt and pepper haired, yet with eyes still sharp. Frank spoke little. His presence was the most powerful testament to what George had done. And at the bow stood Sophie Wells, the 18-year-old girl who had filmed the video, now a true narrator. With a radiant smile, she guided families through every cabin, every scratch, every plaque. Her eyes sparkled just as George's once had, when he was a young sailor, heart brimming with hope, sailing into the unknown. The Newport community had changed too. A wave of remembrance had swept away the apathy that once cloaked this town. Fishermen who had once been indifferent now lent their hands to repaint the boat. Aunt Clara, the cafe owner from years past, organized fundraisers to sustain the commemorative efforts. The town's children no longer threw stones. Instead, they carefully carved George's name onto the wooden plaque on the pier, where passing tourists paused, reading each line with tearful devotion. A Harlan Memorial Center was built, not grand, not ostentatious, but rich in the character of the seaside. It preserved every piece of evidence of the 1968 storm, of George himself, and of the 30 soldiers who had faced life and death alongside him. And Storm's honor, with every scar, every flake of peeling paint, remained steadfast, still gliding upon the waves. It has become a symbol, a testament that memory, when preserved with truth and love, can transcend all scorn and the ravages of time. On social media, the video, "They mocked George," continued to spread. It was no longer merely a clip of outrage. It had become a living document, a warning, a lesson about the haste of judgment. Millions of comments poured in. George Harlan is a light. Storm's honor is memory. The hashtag honor. George became a symbol for commemorations across the nation. Ceremonies of laying wreaths upon the sea, veterans sharing their stories, even history classes, all spoke of George as though he were a living, breathing presence among them. One family wrote, "Mr. Harlan kept my father alive, not by sustaining life, but by preserving his honor." And yet, George did not seek such things. He did not stand upon the deck to hear the applause. He had no need to be called a hero. He simply stood there, quietly, watching families bow their heads to cast flowers upon the sea. Each flower drifting away marked a memory, a farewell, a final breath of those who had once weathered the storm with him. Then Frank drew near and whispered, "You did it, George." George only nodded slightly, his hands tightening upon the metal, as if clutching the souls of the 30 sailors within his palm. Newport, the once forgotten port town, now stood as a beacon of remembrance. From a mere dot on the map, where only fish, nets, and silence once existed, it had become known as a keeper of loyalty, sacrifice, and truth. And Storm's honor, the vessel without weapons, without a national flag, had become a national treasure, a witness that never sleeps. Yet the story was not yet closed, for within the heart of the ocean there always remained secrets that humanity had never touched. And amid the waves that day after day lapped against the hull, it seemed that something awaited revelation, something deeper, something greater, which even George had never revealed. Perhaps it was a portion of memory he kept for himself alone, something only the sea knew, and only time would unveil. George Harlan stood tall on the deck of Storm's Honor. The sea breeze swept over his worn jacket, yet his eyes shone like a lighthouse in the dark night. On his chest, the 1968 medal gleamed quietly, not because of the medal, but because of the weight of memory and nameless sacrifice. The boat beneath his feet, once mocked, had now become an eternal flame. It told the story of a veteran, of comrades lost to tempestuous waves, and of a community that turned its wounds into everlasting pride. Beside George, Frank Dawson, his comrade from years past, and Sophie Wells, the young woman who had captured the poignant video, watched silently as flowers were cast into the bay. The blossoms drifted gently on the water, like souls seeking their way home. Their eyes, one man who had faced life and death, one young woman stepping into adulthood, burned as brightly as George's once had, strong, moved, and unwavering. Newport was no longer a silent port town. It had become a beacon of remembrance, where time could not fade loyalty. Storm's Honor, with storm-scarred hull planks etched deep by the years, was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of survival, and of an indomitable spirit that lives on in the heart of America. George pressed the medal to his chest. His calloused fingers seemed to hold the souls of the brothers who never returned. He offered a faint smile, a fleeting curve of the lips, yet loaded with every emotion. In that moment, he seemed to glimpse his comrades smiling from afar, watching the commemoration with pride and peace. This story is not over. It lives and burns in every heart that cherishes honor and memory. If George's flame has touched you, share it with your friends and loved ones across the United States. Subscribe to Veteran Best Stories to continue spreading inspiring tales of sacrifice, camaraderie, and eternal loyalty. Let Newport, the place of scars and flames, ignite your heart